When I arrived at my family's house for Thanksgiving, my mother simply shut the door in my face and said, "Leave. We don't want you to be part of this anymore. You shame your father's name." So I left, but now they're begging me to come back. Let me back up and explain how I got to that point, because honestly, even I didn't see it coming until I was standing there like an idiot in their fancy doorway. My name's Zach Sanders, and I'm 26 years old. After college, something just went sideways in my life. You know how some people graduate and immediately land these amazing jobs with corner offices and company cars? Yeah, that wasn't me. I bounced between odd jobs, lived off ramen noodles and whatever hope I could scrape together, and slowly watched my bank account dwindle to nothing. For the past 8 months, I'd been crashing in a converted room above my buddy Mike's garage. It was exactly the American dream, but it had a roof, and Mike only charged me $200 a month when I could swing it. Most days I worked delivery for this local sandwich shop called Tony's Subs, driving my beat-up Honda Civic around town, bringing people their lunch while trying not to think about how my life had become a cautionary tale. My family had been giving me the cold shoulder for months. Not outright hostility. Mind you, just that special brand of middle-class disappointment where they'd answer my calls but keep conversations short. My older brother Trevor had graduated business school and married his college sweetheart Sarah. They bought this massive house in one of those Dallas suburbs where every lawn looks like it belongs in a magazine and every driveway has at least 2 cars that cost more than I made in a year. My parents had always been the type who measured success in very specific ways. Dad worked his entire life as a regional manager for a paper company, climbing that corporate ladder one rung at a time until he had a decent pension and a house with a 2-car garage. Mom stayed home until I graduated high school, then got into real estate and did pretty well for herself. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable, and comfort meant everything to them. To them, I represented chaos. I represented the possibility that their carefully constructed middle-class stability could crumble. Every time they looked at me, I could practically see them wondering where they'd gone wrong, what they could have done differently to prevent their youngest son from becoming a cautionary tale about wasted potential. The thing is, I hadn't given up. I was still applying for jobs, still trying to figure out my next move, but in their eyes, I'd already failed, and that failure reflected poorly on the Sanders family name. Dad had worked too hard building a reputation in their community for me to come along and tarnish it with my minimum wage existence. This year, nobody had actually invited me to Thanksgiving. That should have been my first clue. In previous years, Mom would call weeks in advance, asking what I wanted her to make, reminding me what time dinner started, the whole family routine. This year, radio silence. But I figured, hey, it's Thanksgiving. Surely they wouldn't turn away family on Thanksgiving, right? Wrong. So incredibly wrong. I'd spent $43 I didn't really have on gas to drive from my current city to Dallas. I'd even stopped at a grocery store and bought a bottle of wine, thinking maybe a small gesture would help smooth things over. Nothing fancy, just something from the shelf that didn't look completely cheap. When I pulled up to Trevor and Sarah's house, I could see through the big picture windows that they were already deep into dinner. The dining room was full of people. My parents, Trevor and Sarah's parents, a few family friends I recognized. Everyone was dressed nicely. The table was set with actual china, and there were enough side dishes to feed a small army. I knocked on the front door, wine bottle in hand, tried to put on my best everything is fine smile. Sarah answered, and the look on her face immediately told me I'd made a huge mistake. She didn't say hello. She didn't smile. She just looked at me like I was a door-to-door salesman who'd interrupted Christmas morning. Without a word, she turned back toward the dining room and called out that I was there. I heard chairs scraping against hardwood floors, voices dropping to whispers, and then Trevor appeared behind her. My brother looked good. He'd put on a little weight since his wedding, but it was a kind of weight that comes from regular meals and a stable life. He was wearing a button-down shirt and khakis, the uniform of suburban success. When he saw me, his expression didn't change, but I could see something shift in his eyes. He asked me what I was doing there, and I realized how pathetic I must have looked. I was wearing the cleanest clothes I owned, which wasn't saying much. My Honda was parked behind his BMW and Sarah's Lexus, looking like a rusty eyesore in their perfect driveway. I was holding a $12 bottle of wine like it was some kind of peace offering. I told him it was Thanksgiving, as if that explained everything. As if showing up unannounced to a family gathering was perfectly normal when you hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 months. That's when Mom appeared. She'd been watching from the dining room. I realized, watching and probably discussing what to do about me. She walked straight to the front door, without looking at me directly, and I knew I was in trouble. My mother has always been a small woman, but she could project authority like nobody's business. She perfected this particular brand of middle-class disapproval over decades of suburban living. When she was disappointed in you, she didn't yell or scream. She just made you feel like you'd personally let down everyone who'd ever believed in you. She told me they didn't want me to be part of this anymore, that I was shaming Dad's name. The words hit me like a physical blow, partly because they were so final, and partly because I realized she'd probably been thinking them for months. I asked her what I'd done, what specific thing had pushed them over the edge. Was it the job situation? The living arrangement? The fact that I couldn't afford to buy Christmas presents last year? But she just said it was everything. Everything about my life. Everything about my choices. Everything about who I'd become. She said it like I was a problem that had been solved, a burden that had been lifted. Then she opened the front door wider and told me to leave. Just like that. No discussion. No compromise, no chance to explain or defend myself. The conversation was over before it had really begun. I looked past her into the dining room, where everyone was pretending not to watch our little drama unfold. My father was staring at his plate. Trevor had his arm around Sarah's shoulders. Sarah's parents looked uncomfortable but not surprised, which told me this had been discussed before I arrived. Nobody stood up for me. Nobody suggested that maybe we could work things out, that maybe family was more important than whatever shame I brought to their perfectly manicured lives. They'd made their decision, and I was no longer part of the equation. I handed Sarah the wine bottle, told them all to have a nice dinner, and walked back to my car. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, and I sat there for a moment, wondering if anyone would come outside to stop me, to say this had all been a misunderstanding. Nobody did. As I drove away from that house, watching it disappear in my rearview mirror, I realized something had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just a family argument that would blow over after a few weeks. This was an ending. They decided I was too much a liability to their carefully constructed lives, and they cut me loose without a second thought. I drove for hours that night, not really knowing where I was going. I had maybe $30 in my wallet and a quarter tank of gas. I was 26 years old, essentially homeless, and I had just been disowned by the only family I'd ever known. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom. Sometimes it's exactly where you need to be to find something you never knew you were looking for. Sometimes the people who give up on you aren't the ones who matter. Sometimes shame isn't about what you've done wrong, but about what other people can't understand. I didn't know any of that yet, driving away from Dallas that night. All I knew was that I was completely alone, with nowhere to go and no one to call. What I didn't know was that being alone was about to become the best thing that ever happened to me. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours after leaving Dallas, my mind replaying that scene at the front door over and over. The fuel gauge was hovering dangerously close to empty, and my wallet contained exactly $32 and some loose change. I needed to find somewhere to stop, somewhere to figure out what came next. Around midnight, I found myself in one of those small Texas towns that looks like it peaked sometime in the 1970s. Main Street was lined with empty storefronts and buildings that had seen better decades. The only signs of life were a gas station that looked like it doubled as a town social hub, and a diner with a flickering neon sign that promised coffee and pie. I pulled into the gas station and put $15 worth of fuel into my tank, leaving me with just enough cash for maybe one more day of existing. The attendant was a guy about my age with tattoos covering both arms and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he'd been working nights for too long. As I was getting ready to leave, I noticed handwritten signs taped to telephone poles advertising a garage sale. Even at this hour, some optimist had put up directions with arrows pointing toward a residential neighborhood. I had nothing else to do and nowhere else to go, So I figured, why not check it out? Maybe I could find a cheap sleeping bag or something practical for my new life as a person without a fixed address. The garage sale was still going on, which surprised me until I realized it wasn't really a garage sale in the traditional sense. It was more like an estate sale that had spilled out onto the front lawn. An elderly woman was sitting in a folding chair next to card tables covered with the kind of random household items that accumulate over decades of living in one place. She looked up when I approached, and I could tell she was sizing me up, trying to figure out if I was a serious buyer or just someone killing time. I explained that I'd seen the signs and was curious about what she had for sale. Turns out, her neighbor had passed away 3 months earlier, and his adult son lived somewhere on the East Coast and couldn't be bothered to deal with his father's belongings. The woman, whose name was Betty, had offered to handle the sale and donate whatever didn't sell to charity. She seemed lonely, like she was grateful for the company even if I wasn't planning to buy much. I wandered around the tables, looking at the usual assortment of kitchen gadgets, books, and random electronics that end up at these kinds of sales. Nothing caught my attention until I spotted an old boombox sitting next to a cardboard box filled with cassette tapes. The boombox was one of those massive silver and black models from the late 80s, the kind that required 8D batteries and could probably wake up the entire neighborhood. It looked like it had been well maintained, and when I asked Betty about it, she plugged it in and demonstrated that it still worked perfectly. The box of cassette tapes was what really interested me, though. There had to be 50 or 60 tapes in there, all hand-labeled in the same careful handwriting. Most of them seemed to be music, classic rock, country, some jazz, but there were also several that were simply labeled with dates going back to the early 1990s. Betty noticed me examining the tapes and explained that her neighbor, Thomas Williams, had been something of a character. He'd worked for the Postal Service for 30 years, lived alone after his wife died, and had developed some unusual habits in his later years. One of those habits was recording himself talking, kind of like keeping an audio diary. She told me I could have the boom box and all the tapes for $20, which was more than I want to spend but less than I would have expected to pay. Something about the whole setup intrigued me, and I found myself handing over the money before I could talk myself out of it. I loaded everything into my car and drove to a 24-hour Walmart parking lot where I figured I could spend the night without anyone bothering me. I'd heard that Walmart was generally okay with people sleeping in their cars in the parking lot, and I needed somewhere safe to figure out my next move. I set up the boom box in my passenger seat and started going through the tapes. The music ones were exactly what you'd expect from someone of Thomas Williams' generation: Eagles, Fleetwood Mac, Johnny Cash, B.B. King. But the dated tapes were something else entirely. I picked one labeled March 15th, 1997, and popped it into the player. What I heard was the voice of a man who sounded like he was probably in his 60s, speaking clearly and deliberately into a microphone. He was talking about his day, his thoughts about politics, memories of his late wife, complaints about his neighbors. It was oddly intimate, like listening to someone's private thoughts. The quality was surprisingly good, and Thomas Williams had a pleasant voice, the kind that would have been perfect for radio. He spoke with the careful diction of someone who'd grown up when people still cared about proper grammar and pronunciation. There was something comforting about listening to him ramble about everyday life, and I found myself relaxing for the first time since leaving Dallas. I went through several more tapes, jumping around different years and dates. Each one was like a time capsule, capturing not just Thomas Williams' personal experiences, but also his reactions to world events, changes in his neighborhood, the gradual transformation of his small town. He was articulate and observant, the kind of person who noticed details that other people missed. But it was a tape labeled December 10th, 2019, that changed everything. This one was different from the others. Thomas Williams sounded older, more frail, but also more urgent. He started by saying that if someone was listening to this tape, he was probably already dead, which got my attention immediately. He explained that he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer and had maybe 6 months to live. His son lived in Boston and had made it clear that he wasn't interested in maintaining any kind of relationship with his father. Thomas Williams had accepted that he would die alone, but there were some things he needed to say first, some information he needed to preserve. What he said next made me sit up straight in my car seat and rewind the tape to make sure I'd heard correctly. He talked about how he'd never trusted banks completely, especially after seeing what happened during the savings and loan crisis in the late 80s. He'd kept most of his money in certificates of deposit and savings accounts, but he'd also set aside a substantial amount in what he called insurance, physical assets that couldn't disappear if the financial system collapsed. In 1975, when he was working for the Postal Service and making decent money, he'd purchased a significant number of government bonds and treasury bills. Instead of keeping them in a bank-safe deposit box, he'd found what he considered a more secure location, a hiding place that only he knew about. The location he described was specific and detailed. An old Carnegie library on the south side of Tucson that had been closed for renovations but never reopened. He'd apparently befriended the caretaker back in the day and had been given access to store some personal items in a secure area of the building. Thomas Williams provided exact directions to find this hiding place, including the combination to a lockbox that he'd installed himself. He estimated that the bonds and certificates, with accumulated interest over the decades, would be worth several $100,000 by now. But here's the part that really got my attention. He explicitly stated that he didn't want his son to inherit any of this money. His son had never shown any interest in his father's life, had never called or visited, had made it clear that he considered Thomas Williams an embarrassment and a burden. Instead, Thomas Williams said he was leaving this information for whoever found the tape, whoever took the time to listen to an old man's recorded thoughts. In his words, if someone cared enough to hear his voice, they deserved to benefit from what he'd saved. I sat in that Walmart parking lot until dawn, listening to the tape over and over, taking notes, trying to decide if this was real or if I was losing my mind. The specificity of the information, the emotion in Thomas Williams' voice, the fact that he'd clearly put a lot of thought into this decision, it all seemed genuine. By the time the sun came up, I'd made my decision. I had nothing left to lose, no family to disappoint, no reputation to protect. If Thomas Williams' story was true, I might have just stumbled onto the opportunity that would change my life. If it was false or if someone else had already found the hiding place, I'd be exactly where I started, broken alone, but no worse off than before. I used the gas station bathroom to clean up, bought a coffee and a breakfast sandwich with some of my remaining money, and started driving toward Arizona. It would take me most of the day to reach Tucson, assuming my car held together for the journey. As I drove through the desert landscape, I kept thinking about Thomas Williams and the parallels between his situation and mine. Both of us had been rejected by family members who considered us disappointments. Both of us had been left to figure out life on our own. The difference was that he'd had decades to prepare for his isolation, while mine was still fresh and raw. But maybe that was exactly why I was the person who was supposed to find this tape. Maybe Thomas Williams had been waiting for someone who would understand what it felt like to be discarded, someone who would appreciate the opportunity he was offering. By the time I reached the Arizona state line, I was no longer the same person who'd been turned away from Thanksgiving dinner. I was someone with a mission, someone with hope, someone who might finally have caught a break. Getting to Tucson was only half the battle. Finding a library that had been closed for decades turned out to be more complicated than I'd expected. Thomas Williams had been specific about the location, south side of the city, built in 1923, closed for renovations in 1998, but tracking down a building that had been essentially abandoned for over 20 years required some detective work. I spent my first day in Tucson at the main public library, using their computers to research the history of Carnegie libraries in the area. The librarian, a woman named Maria, who looked like she'd been working there since the building opened, was incredibly helpful once I explained that I was researching local architectural history for a project. She pulled up old city records and newspaper articles that mentioned several Carnegie libraries that had been built in Tucson during the early 20th century. Most of them had been demolished or converted into other uses, but there was one on South 6th Avenue that matched Thomas Williams' description perfectly. According to the records, the South 6 Carnegie Library had been closed in 1998 for what were supposed to be temporary renovations. The city had run out of funding halfway through the project, and the building had been sitting empty ever since. It was still owned by the city, officially classified as a historic property awaiting restoration that would probably never happen. Maria printed out some old photographs and a basic floor plan that showed the library's layout. It was a classic Carnegie design, 2 stories, red brick construction, with a basement level that had originally been used for storage and mechanical systems. Looking at those pictures, I could almost see exactly where Thomas Williams would have hidden his treasure. The next morning, I drove to South 6th Avenue and found the building. It was even more impressive in person than in the photographs. Despite being in rough condition, the red brick facade was still beautiful underneath decades of weather damage and neglect. The windows were boarded up, and there was a chain-link fence around the perimeter with signs warning about trespassing and structural hazards. I sat in my car across the street, trying to figure out how to get inside without getting arrested. The building was clearly abandoned, but it was also clearly city property, which meant that breaking and entering would be a felony rather than just a misdemeanor. I needed a legitimate way to access the building, or at least a way that wouldn't result in jail time. That's when I noticed the security guard. He was an older Hispanic man, probably in his 60s, sitting in a folding chair next to a small trailer that had been set up in the parking lot behind the building. He had a thermos of coffee and was reading a paperback novel, the kind of relaxed vigilance that suggested this was a pretty boring assignment. I spent about an hour watching him, trying to get a sense of his routine. He walked around the building's perimeter every 30 minutes or so, checking doors and windows, but mostly he just sat in his chair and read. He seemed like a reasonable person, not someone who was looking for trouble or trying to flex his authority. Finally, I decided to just approach him directly and tell him the truth. Well, most of the truth anyway. I walked across the street and introduced myself, explaining that I was trying to research the history of the building for a project about Carnegie libraries. I mentioned that I'd found some old documents that reference items that might still be stored inside, and I wondered if there was any way to arrange a brief tour. The security guard's name was Miguel, and he'd been working this particular assignment for about 5 years. He told me that the city occasionally sent people to inspect the building or retrieve records, but that had been months since anyone had shown any interest in the place. He seemed genuinely pleased to have someone to talk to. I showed him the photocopies I'd made at the library, including the floor plan and some of the historical information I'd gathered. I explained that I found a recording of a former postal worker who claimed to have stored some personal items in the building back in the 1970s, and that I was curious about whether anything was still there. Miguel listened to my story with the kind of patient attention that suggested he'd heard stranger things during his years as a security guard. When I finished explaining, he was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee and considering my request. Then he told me something that made my heart race. He said he remembered Thomas Williams. Back in the late 90s, when the building was being prepared for renovation, Miguel had worked for the contractor that was handling the initial assessment. Thomas Williams had shown up one day with official-looking paperwork, claiming that he'd been storing some Postal Service documents in the building's basement and needed to retrieve them before the renovation began. Miguel had escorted him into the building and watched him remove several boxes from what appeared to be a makeshift storage area behind the old card catalog system. Thomas Williams had been polite and professional, and his paperwork had looked legitimate, so Miguel hadn't questioned the arrangement. What Miguel found interesting, looking back on it now, was that Thomas Williams had seemed to know exactly where everything was located. He hadn't needed to search or explore. He'd walked directly to a specific area and retrieved exactly what he wanted. It was almost like he'd been storing things there for years and was completely familiar with the building's layout. This information was both encouraging and terrifying. It suggested that Thomas Williams' story was real, that he actually had used the building as a hiding place. But it also meant that he'd already removed at least some of the stored items back in the late 90s. Miguel could see the disappointment on my face, and I think he felt bad about crushing my hopes. After another long pause, he made a decision that changed everything. He told me that he'd been curious about that basement storage area ever since his encounter with Thomas Williams. Over the years, during his routine security checks, he'd noticed that the area behind the old card catalog system was more extensive than it appeared from the main floor. There were alcoves and storage spaces that weren't shown on the official floor plans. Miguel offered to take me into the building for a quick look around, with the understanding that this was purely unofficial and that I wouldn't touch or remove anything without proper authorization. He seemed genuinely curious about whether Thomas Williams had left anything else behind. We entered through a side door that Miguel unlocked with a key from a security ring. The inside of the building was like stepping into a time capsule. Everything had been covered with plastic sheeting and dust cloths when the renovation project was halted, and it had remained virtually untouched for over 20 years. The main floor still looked like a library, with empty shelving units arranged in neat rows and circulation desks covered in heavy plastic. Our footsteps echoed in the empty space, and dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the boarded windows. Miguel led me down a narrow staircase to the basement level, where the temperature was noticeably cooler and the air smelled of old books and concrete. This level had originally been used for mechanical systems and document storage, and it was divided into several smaller rooms and alcoves. The area behind what had been the card catalog system was exactly as Thomas Williams had described it on the tape. There was a narrow corridor that led to a small storage room that wasn't visible from the main basement area. Miguel explained that this space had probably been used by library staff to store seasonal decorations and surplus supplies. In the back corner of the storage room, partially hidden behind some old filing cabinets, I found what I was looking for. It was a metal lockbox, the kind that might be used to store important documents or small valuables. It was mounted to the wall with heavy brackets and secured with a combination lock that looked like it had been installed sometime in the 1970s. I pulled out the notes I'd taken while listening to Thomas Williams' tape and tried the combination he provided. July 14th, 65. The date he'd explained was the day he'd married his wife. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside the box, wrapped in plastic bags and sealed with tape that had yellowed with age, were documents that represented more money than I'd ever imagined possessing. Government bonds, treasury bills, certificates of deposit from banks that had been merged or acquired decades ago. Each document was carefully labeled with purchase dates, maturity information, and estimated values. I didn't touch anything. Didn't remove any of the documents from their protective wrapping. I just took photographs with my phone, making sure to capture every detail of every document. Miguel watched over my shoulder, occasionally whistling softly when he saw some of the dollar amounts. According to Thomas Williams' careful record-keeping, the face value of the bonds and certificates was close to $400,000. But these weren't just any government securities. Some of them had been purchased during periods of extremely high interest rates in the late 1970s and early 1980s. With compound interest over more than 40 years, their current value would be substantially higher. I closed the lockbox and reset the combination, leaving everything exactly as I had found it. Miguel and I returned to main floor in silence, both of us processing what we just discovered. Before we left the building, Miguel made me promise that I would handle whatever came next legally and properly. He'd taken a risk by letting me into the building, and he didn't want either of us to get into trouble over this discovery. I assured him that I had no intention of just taking the documents and disappearing. Thomas Williams had been clear in his recorded instructions. He wanted whoever found this cash to inherit it legally, not steal it. That meant going through proper channels and making sure everything was handled according to law. Over the next 2 days, I researched estate attorneys in Tucson and found one who specialized in unusual inheritance cases. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chun, listened to my story with professional skepticism until I played portions of Thomas Williams' tape and showed her the photographs I'd taken in the library. Patricia explained that Thomas Williams had essentially created what was known as a treasure trove situation, property that had been deliberately hidden with the intention that it be found by someone other than the legal heirs. Arizona law had specific provisions for handling such cases, especially when there was clear documentation of the original owner's intentions. The process would take several months and would require court approval, but Patricia was confident that Thomas Williams' recorded instructions would hold up legally. She'd seen similar cases before, and the fact that he'd been so specific about his intentions and had provided detailed documentation would work in my favor. As I left Patricia's office that afternoon, I realized that my life had changed completely in the span of just a few days. I was no longer a broke delivery driver sleeping in his car. I was potentially the inheritor of a substantial fortune, left to me by a man I'd never met, but who seemed to understand exactly what I was going through. The legal process took 4 months, which was actually faster than Patricia Chun had initially predicted. Arizona's treasure trove laws were surprisingly straightforward, and Thomas Williams had documented his intentions so thoroughly that there wasn't much room for dispute. The only potential complication was his son in Boston, who had to be officially notified of the proceedings. During those 4 months, I got a job at a local moving company in Tucson and rented a small apartment near downtown. It wasn't much, a studio with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette that barely qualified as a kitchen, but it was mine, and I was paying for it with money I'd earned myself. For the first time in months, I felt like I was building something instead of just surviving. The work was physical and demanding, but I found that I actually enjoyed it. There was something satisfying about helping people transition from one phase of their lives to another, about being trusted with their possessions during vulnerable moments. Plus, my co-workers were a mix of college students, retirees looking for extra income, and guys like me who were trying to get their lives back on track. Nobody asked too many questions about your past, and everybody understood that sometimes you needed a fresh start. Patricia kept me updated on the legal proceedings through regular phone calls and emails. Thomas Williams' son had been contacted and had expressed zero interest in contesting the inheritance. In fact, according to the lawyer who represented him in Boston, he seemed relieved that he wouldn't have to deal with his father's affairs at all. The government bonds and treasury bills were transferred to a secure account while their current values were being assessed. As Thomas Williams had predicted, the accumulated interest over 4 decades had increased their worth significantly. The final valuation came to just over $2 million. $2 million. I had to keep saying the number out loud to make it feel real. But here's the thing about suddenly having money when you've never had money before. It doesn't change who you are as much as you think it will. I was still the same guy who'd been turned away from Thanksgiving dinner, still carrying the same emotional baggage from being rejected by my family. The money was just a tool, and what mattered was how I chose to use it. I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance while the legal process was ongoing. I especially didn't tell my family. Part of me wanted to wait until everything was completely final before I made any decisions about how to handle that relationship. But mostly, I just wasn't ready to deal with their reaction. That changed when my phone rang on a Tuesday evening in March. It was my mother, which surprised me because we hadn't spoken since that disaster of a Thanksgiving dinner. Her voice sounded different, softer, more uncertain than I was used to hearing. She started by asking how I was doing, where I was living, whether I was okay. For a moment, I thought maybe she was calling to apologize, to admit that they'd handled the situation badly and wanted to make things right. Then she got to the real reason for her call. Trevor was in financial trouble. Serious financial trouble. Apparently, he'd made some bad investment decisions and had gotten overextended on credit. The big house in Dallas, the one where I'd been turned away from Thanksgiving dinner, was about to go into foreclosure. Sarah's parents had already bailed him out once, but they weren't willing to do it again. My parents had helped as much as they could, but their retirement savings were now almost depleted. My mother explained all of this in the careful, measured tone she'd always used when she was trying to manage a crisis, without admitting that it was actually a crisis. She made it sound like a temporary setback, a minor bump in the road that just needed a little family support to resolve. Then she asked if I might be able to help. I almost laughed out loud. Here was the same woman who'd told me I was shaming the family name, who'd literally shut the door in my face and told me I wasn't welcome anymore. Now she was calling to ask for money, as if the past few months hadn't happened, as if I was supposed to forget how they'd treated me just because they needed something from me. I told her I'd think about it and call her back, which bought me some time to process what was happening. The timing was almost surreal. Just as I was about to inherit a substantial amount of money, my family was suddenly facing financial ruin. It felt like some kind of cosmic test, a challenge to see whether I learned anything from Thomas Williams' example. Over the next few days, I got additional calls from Trevor himself and even from Sarah. Each conversation followed the same basic pattern. Expressions of regret about how things had been handled, explanations about how desperate their situation had become, and carefully worded requests for financial assistance. Trevor was the most direct about it. He apologized for the way the family had treated me and acknowledged that they'd been wrong to cut me off. But then, he immediately pivoted to talking about the foreclosure timeline and how much money they needed to save the house. It was clear that his apology was motivated by necessity rather than genuine remorse. Sarah's approach was more emotional. She talked about how much she'd always liked me, how she tried to convince Trevor to reach out sooner, how terrible she felt about what had happened at Thanksgiving. But her request for help was just as calculated as everyone else's. The most revealing conversation was with my father. Dad had always been the strong, silent type who preferred to let Mom handle family communications. The fact that he was calling me directly meant that the situation was even worse than they'd been letting on. He started by telling me that he was proud of me for getting my life together, for finding steady work and a place to live. He said he'd always believed I would figure things out eventually, and he was sorry that the family hadn't been more supportive during my difficult period. Then he explained that Trevor's problems were bigger than just the house. There were business debts, credit card balances, and some kind of tax situation that could result in criminal charges if it wasn't resolved quickly. The family needed at least $300,000 to make everything go away, and they were running out of options. $300,000. My father asked if I had any ideas about where they might be able to get that kind of money. He didn't directly ask me to provide it, but the implication was clear. He was fishing to see if I had resources they didn't know about, hoping I might have connections or opportunities that could help solve their crisis. I told him I'd see what I could do, which was true, but probably not in the way he was hoping. After that conversation, I spent several days thinking about Thomas Williams and what he would have done in this situation. Here was a man who'd been rejected by his son, who'd died alone and forgotten, but who'd still managed to create something meaningful with his life. His legacy wasn't just the money he'd saved. It was a decision to pass that money on to someone who would appreciate it and use it wisely. My family had made their position clear when they shut the door in my face. They decided that I was a liability, someone who didn't deserve to be part of their carefully constructed lives. Now that they needed something from me, they were suddenly interested in reconciliation, but only on their terms and only for their benefit. I made my decision on a Friday afternoon while I was helping an elderly woman move from her house into an assisted living facility. She'd lived in the same place for 60 years, and every box we packed contained memories and mementos from a full life. She was sad about leaving, but she was also excited about starting a new chapter. As we loaded her belongings into the truck, she told me about her family, children who lived across the country, grandchildren she saw maybe once a year, siblings who'd grown apart over the decades. She wasn't bitter about it, just realistic. People change, she said. Families drift apart. The important thing was to focus on relationships that mattered and not waste energy trying to fix the ones that were broken beyond repair. That night, I called my mother back. I told her that I'd been thinking about their situation and that I wanted to help, but not in the way they were expecting. Instead of giving them money directly, I wanted to use whatever resources I could access to create something more sustainable. I explained that I was planning to start a foundation focused on helping people who were struggling financially due to circumstances beyond their control. The foundation would provide emergency assistance, job training, and financial counseling to individuals and families who needed a fresh start. Trevor and Sarah could apply for assistance through the foundation, just like anyone else. If their situation qualified under the program guidelines, they might be eligible for help, but they have to go through the same application process as everyone else, and they'd have to demonstrate that they were committed to making the changes necessary to avoid similar problems in the future. My mother was quiet for a long time after I finished explaining this plan. Finally, she asked if I was seriously suggesting that my own family should have to apply for charity from a foundation I was creating. I told her that yes, that was exactly what I was suggesting. The reaction was about what I'd expected. Trevor called me later that night, furious about what he saw as a betrayal. He accused me of using their crisis as an opportunity for revenge, of deliberately humiliating them when they were at their most vulnerable. Sarah sent me a series of text messages explaining how disappointed she was in my response, how she'd hoped I was a better person than this, how my refusal to help would affect not just them, but also their children's future. My father didn't call at all, which somehow hurt more than the angry conversations with Trevor and Sarah. But my mother's reaction was the most telling. She called me back the next morning and told me that the family had discussed my proposal and decided that they couldn't accept help under those conditions. She said it would be too embarrassing, too demeaning, too much an admission that they'd failed. Then she said something that revealed exactly how she really felt about me and my situation. She told me that whatever money I thought I had access to was probably not as much as I imagined, and that I was being naive if I thought I could solve everyone's problems by playing philanthropist. She suggested that I should focus on getting my own life completely stable before I try to help anyone else. In other words, she still saw me as a failure who'd been turned away from Thanksgiving dinner. The possibility that I might actually have substantial resources, that I might be in a position to help them or anyone else, was something she couldn't accept. That conversation clarified everything for me. My family's sudden interest in reconciliation had nothing to do with missing me or regretting how they'd treated me. It was purely transactional, based on what they thought they could get from me. When I offered to help on my terms rather than theirs, they immediately reverted to treating me like the disappointing family member they'd always seen me as. 2 weeks later, the legal proceedings were finalized and Thomas Williams' inheritance was officially transferred to me. I was suddenly worth around $2 million, plus the small amount I'd managed to save from my job at the moving company. I quit my job and spent the next month developing a business plan for the foundation I'd told my family about. It wasn't just a way to avoid giving them money directly. It was something I genuinely want to create, inspired by Thomas Williams' example of using his resources to help someone who needed a fresh start. I also bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood near downtown Tucson. Nothing fancy but comfortable and entirely mine. For the first time in my adult life, I had a home that nobody could take away from me, a place where I belonged without having to apologize for existing. My family never applied for assistance in the foundation, which told me everything I needed to know about how serious their financial crisis actually was. If they'd really needed help as desperately as they claimed, they would have swallowed their pride and gone through the application process. Instead, they found other solutions. My parents sold their house and moved into a smaller place. Trevor and Sarah's house did go into foreclosure, but they managed to arrange a short sale and avoided bankruptcy. Sarah got a job for the first time since college, and Trevor started working for someone else instead of trying to run his own business. In other words, they did exactly what millions of other Americans do when they face financial difficulties. They made sacrifices, adjusted their lifestyle, and found ways to solve their problems without expecting anyone else to bail them out. They could have done all of that without asking me for money in the first place. But doing so would have required admitting that their perfect suburban lifestyle wasn't as stable as they pretended, and that was something they couldn't bring themselves to do until they had no other choice. The irony wasn't lost on me. The family that had rejected me for failing to live up to their standards had ended up needing exactly the kind of fresh start that I'd been trying to create for myself all along. The difference was that Thomas Williams had given me the tools to build something better. My family had to figure out on their own, just like I had.